So, if you want to know why your grocery bill is about to spike, or why mortgage rates might jump next month, you really shouldn't be looking at domestic inflation data.
No, absolutely not. You need to look much further away.
Right. Look at a 21-mile stretch of water halfway across the world. Because, imagine a bottleneck so vital that 1/5 of the entire planet's energy supply relies on it.
It's massive.
Yeah, and now imagine two massive military forces staring each other down across that water, essentially turning off the tap for the global economy.
Which is exactly what we're seeing right now.
Exactly. So, welcome. Today, we are taking a custom-tailored deep dive into the Strait of Hormuz. We are untangling this massive geopolitical knot involving high-stakes, closed-door negotiations between the U.S. and China.
And the psychology of trust and diplomacy, too.
Yes, and the immediate financial shockwaves hitting literally everything from manufacturing to the bond market.
Because we're looking well past the minute-by-minute headlines today. To genuinely understand the situation, we have to analyze it through the mechanics of international geopolitics.
Which is a lot to unpack.
It is. We're going to connect a physical naval blockade to the engine of global trade. And, examine the diplomatic chess matches happening simultaneously in Beijing, Washington, and Tehran.
Right.
This is really about seeing the invisible strings that tie a stalled oil tanker in the Middle East to the price of everyday goods in your local store.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump right into the timeline and the actual geography here, because the physical reality of the Strait of Hormuz basically dictates everything else.
Yeah, the geography is everything here.
So the catalyst for this current freeze traces back to February 28th, when U.S. and Israeli attacks began. And in direct response to those strikes, Iran essentially slammed the door shut on the Strait of Hormuz for most commercial shipping.
Just completely shut it down.
Right. The U.S. then paused its attacks last month, but they replaced them with a strict port blockade. So, Tehran retaliated by flat-out refusing to reopen the strait until the U.S. lifts that blockade. So we have two heavily armed actors, and neither of them feels they can afford the political cost of blinking first.
Yeah, and the geography is what weaponizes this whole standoff. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide.
Wow, just 21 miles.
Yeah, and the shipping lanes themselves, like the deep water channels that are required for those massive supertankers, they're only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
That is a tiny needle to thread.
Exactly. So when a state actor shuts down a choke point with those dimensions, it basically acts as a valve on the entire global economy.
Well, wait, I am going to push back on the permanence of that valve, though.
Okay.
Because, necessity is the mother of invention. If a waterway holding back 1/5 of the world's energy is shut down, the global market doesn't just sit on its hands, right?
You'd think so, yeah.
There are thousands of brilliant logisticians out there. Surely, neighboring countries and these massive corporations are already finding workarounds, trying backdoor routes, or moving cargo over land. You can't just stop that much global traffic without someone finding a detour.
See, that intuition makes sense on paper, but it completely falls apart when you look at the sheer physics and the volume of what moves through that strait.
Okay, how so?
Well, we're talking about roughly 21 million barrels of oil every single day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You do not just load 21 million barrels of oil onto a fleet of trucks. The infrastructure required to move that volume overland takes decades to build.
Right, you can't just pave a new highway for that overnight.
Exactly. And as for finding a detour by sea, well, the issue isn't just physical barricades. It is the invisible barricade of the global insurance market.
Wait, the insurance market is dictating naval movements?
Oh, absolutely. Insurance is the invisible hand of global trade. The sources note that vessels have already been sunk during this conflict.
Right.
Others have been boarded and redirected by Iranian forces. So when that level of physical danger exists, underwriters at Lloyd's of London and other major maritime insurers, they simply stop writing policies.
Or they charge a fortune.
Right. They raise what they call war risk premiums to levels that just bankrupt the shipping companies. If a ship carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil is hit by a missile, the environmental catastrophe and the financial loss are just insurmountable.
So no insurance means no ship sail.
Exactly. The corporate fleets are completely paralyzed.
And it isn't just standard crude oil sitting behind this blockade either, because I saw the sources highlight that massive quantities of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, also pass through Hormuz.
Yeah, and LNG adds a terrifying variable to the risk assessment.
Because it's so volatile.
Very. Liquefied natural gas is supercooled, highly pressurized fuel, An LNG tanker is essentially a massive floating bomb if it gets targeted by military ordnance.
That is horrifying.
Yeah. Shipping crews will simply refuse to sail into a militarized zone while sitting on top of a giant pressurized gas canister, regardless of what their corporate bosses demand.
Okay, so if the sea is entirely paralyzed by both military threat and insurance mechanics, any workaround has to be terrestrial.
Right.
And I saw in the sources that the United Arab Emirates is frantically speeding up construction of a new pipeline to bypass the strait entirely.
Yeah, the UAE pipeline project illustrates the desperation perfectly. They are trying to build this massive pipeline connecting their oil fields directly to the port of Fujairah.
Fujairah, okay.
Yeah, if you look at a map, you'll see why Fujairah matters so much.
Yeah.
It sits on the Gulf of Oman, which is just outside the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, so it's past the choke point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It offers a physical bypass to load oil safely outside the danger zone. But building a pipeline capable of handling significant global capacity requires forging thousands of tons of steel.
Right, acquiring right-of-ways, building pumping stations.
Testing the infrastructure, all of it. It is a mega project that takes years and billions of dollars. It does not solve a supply crisis happening this week.
Right, since we cannot engineer our way out of this by next Tuesday, the immediate consequence is a massive supply shock.
Absolute massive.
Because before this standoff, 20% of the world's oil and LNG, plus massive amounts of fertilizer, vital for global agriculture, pass through this specific waterway.
Yeah.
And we are watching the markets react violently to that reality. Oil prices have already surged roughly 3%, sitting at around $109 a barrel right now.
Which is high.
Yeah, and traders are baking in the fear that this blockade has no definitive end in sight.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, a jump to $109 a barrel is a huge shock to the system. But the real danger is the contagion effect.
The ripple effect.
Right. When energy prices spike, the impact is not confined to the gasoline you put in your car. Energy is the foundational cost of modern civilization.
It's in everything.
Everything. When oil and LNG get more expensive, the cost to power a manufacturing plant skyrockets. The cost to produce the plastic for packaging skyrockets.
Even just the diesel required to truck goods from a seaport to your local grocery store.
Doubles. Every single step of the supply chain gets more expensive, and companies pass those costs directly to you, the consumer.
And the result is this tidal wave of global inflation. And what is fascinating, and honestly a bit alarming, is how quickly the financial markets are bracing for that wave.
We are moving fast.
Yeah. The sources indicate that U.S. Treasury yields have hit their highest point in roughly a year, specifically because of this standoff.
Yeah.
Let's break down the mechanics of Treasury yields for a moment because, it sounds like abstract Wall Street noise, but it dictates our actual cost of living.
It really does. Think of the U.S. bond market as an incredibly sensitive early warning system for the global economy. When investors watch oil hit $109 a barrel, they instantly calculate that massive inflation is coming. And central banks, like the U.S. Federal Reserve, well, they only have one primary weapon to fight inflation.
Raising interest rates to cool down spending.
Precisely. They make money more expensive to borrow.
Right.
So when Treasury yields spike to a one-year high, the market is essentially declaring that the Federal Reserve will be forced to hike interest rates to combat the inflation caused by the Strait of Hormuz.
Wow. So for anyone listening, that means the interest rate on a new mortgage, the financing for a car loan, and the penalty rates on credit card debt.
Yeah.
They are all being pushed upward by a naval blockade thousands of miles away.
It's all connected.
So if the physical logistics take years to fix and the global economy is bleeding out today, the only immediate solution has to be political.
That has to be.
Which pivots the entire crisis away from the water and into closed-door diplomatic meetings. Which brings us to the recent summit in Beijing. President Trump just flew back from 2 days of intense talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And the messaging from the U.S. side is highly aggressive.
Very firm stance.
Yeah, Trump's patience with Iran is running out. He demands the strait be opened immediately, and he insists on ensuring Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon.
The dynamic between Washington and Beijing right now is honestly a masterclass in leverage and geopolitical calculus. I mean, both nations have massive yet conflicting interests in the Middle East.
And Trump's strategy for navigating that conflict is incredibly direct. He detailed a very explicit no-favors policy to reporters.
Yeah, the no-favors approach.
Right. He stated clearly that he did not ask China for any favors regarding pressuring Iran. His logic, as quoted, is that when you ask for favors, you have to do favors in return.
which makes sense from a business perspective.
Yeah, it's a rejection of traditional coalition-building diplomacy in favor of purely transactional negotiations. And on a transactional level, it actually seems to be generating some movement.
It does.
Trump claims Xi promised not to send military equipment to Iran and opposes Iran charging a transit toll in the strait. And simultaneously, the U.S. is considering lifting sanctions on Chinese oil companies.
See, that transactional approach is meant to isolate issues into neat tradable commodities. You lift sanctions on my oil companies, I stop sending weapons to your adversary.
Simple trade.
Right. However, applying a purely transactional strategy against a state that operates on multi-decade geopolitical timelines like China is incredibly difficult.
Well, I want to look closely at China's actual incentives here, because on the surface, it sounds like a delicate three-way negotiation where nobody wants to admit they need the other.
It's a standoff.
Yeah. The U.S. needs the strait open to stop a domestic economic crisis. China obviously needs the oil to fuel its massive manufacturing base. Iran needs leverage to survive economic strangulation.
Exactly.
But honestly, what is China's actual incentive to squeeze Iran here? If the U.S. is bogged down in the Middle East, doesn't that directly benefit China?
You've hit on the core strategic dilemma right there. We have to unpack China's counterweight strategy.
Okay.
Because publicly, Beijing is playing the role of the frustrated peacemaker. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a blunt statement declaring this conflict should never have happened and has no reason to continue.
Right. They are projecting an image of the responsible global superpower wanting stability for trade.
But geopolitical analysts look right past those press releases because China is the single largest buyer of Iranian oil.
Wow, the biggest buyer.
Biggest. They have a massive vested interest in keeping Tehran's economy afloat, which is exactly why lifting U.S. sanctions on Chinese oil companies is the carrot being dangled.
Oh.
Yet the calculus goes far beyond petroleum. Iran serves as an incredibly valuable strategic counterweight to the United States in the region.
So think of it like a global seesaw. Every aircraft carrier strike group, every intelligence asset, and every diplomatic hour the United States has to dedicate to the Strait of Hormuz.
Is bandwidth they cannot apply to the South China Sea or the Pacific Theater.
Exactly.
The mechanism of distraction is incredibly valuable to Beijing. China doesn't have to fire a single shot or overtly supply weapons, which, by the way, they have dismissed as groundless smears, to benefit from this situation.
Right. They just need the distraction to continue.
They simply need Iran to remain a viable, persistent thorn in Washington's side. Therefore, analysts highly doubt President Xi will apply enough pressure on Tehran to cause the Iranian regime to collapse or entirely capitulate to U.S. demands.
They want a balance.
Yeah, Beijing wants the oil to flow, but they absolutely do not want a decisive, overwhelming American victory in the Middle East.
And that tightrope walk by China makes the situation even more precarious for Iran. So here's where it gets really interesting. Let's pivot to Tehran's perspective.
Okay.
Because to understand why a stalemate lasts this long, you have to look at the psychology of the negotiators. This isn't just a dispute over transit tolls. It is rooted in a fundamental historical lack of trust.
A huge lack of trust.
Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has publicly stated that the U.S. has sent messages indicating a willingness to continue talks. So Tehran is acknowledging the diplomatic back channels.
They're acknowledging them, sure, but treating them with profound skepticism.
Why?
Because the historical precedent, from Tehran's point of view, makes good faith negotiation nearly impossible. Previous rounds of diplomacy were abruptly severed by U.S. military action and airstrikes.
Right, the strikes we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. How do you convince a regime to lay down its leverage, in this case the blockade of the strait, when they genuinely believe the moment they do, the bombs will start falling again?
You can't, and that trust deficit is magnified 100 times over by the nuclear sticking point. Iran continuously denies having intentions to build a nuclear weapon.
Right.
Yet they categorically refuse to halt their nuclear research or hand over their hidden stockpile of enriched uranium. And that stockpile is a massive point of friction for the U.S. administration.
Huge friction.
Interestingly, Trump did an interview on Fox News where he framed the goal of securing that uranium in an unexpected way. He suggested the U.S. needed to secure it for, quote, public relations.
Yeah, framing a seizure of enriched uranium as public relations really exposes the dual nature of international conflict.
What do you mean?
Well, there's a military objective, and then there's the domestic political optics. In a high-stakes standoff, projecting strength to your own voters is a form of vital political currency.
Ah, I see.
Securing the uranium allows an administration to declare a definitive, tangible victory to the public, proving they neutralized a boogeyman, regardless of whether the military threat was actually imminent.
But the reality on the ground inside Iran has moved completely past political optics. The domestic mobilization reported in the sources is staggering.
It's hard to even comprehend.
Right. More than 31 million Iranians have signed up for a campaign demonstrating their readiness to defend the country. We are talking about civilians starting weapons courses for pro-government volunteers.
That changes everything.
When you have 31 million citizens actively training for war, a society has fundamentally shifted its psychology, and that is against the backdrop of thousands of Iranians who were already killed in the initial U.S. and Israeli airstrikes.
Yeah, this raises an important question about the mechanics of societal militarization, which dictate the limits of diplomacy.
Right.
Once a government puts rifles in the hands of millions of civilians, organizes mass defense campaigns, and declares that the survival of the nation is at stake, the leadership basically burns its own bridges.
They can't back down.
They lose the political capital required to compromise. If the Iranian leadership were to suddenly lift the blockade and submit to U.S. demands after mobilizing 31 million people,
It would look like weakness.
worse, it would not be viewed domestically as a savvy diplomatic maneuver. It would be viewed as treason. The militarization of the public hardens the diplomatic lines into concrete.
And the pressure cooker isn't contained just to Iran's borders either. You have to map this onto the broader regional powder keg to see how fragile the whole structure is.
It's a very fragile ecosystem.
Yeah, the sources point out the renewed, devastating fighting in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, an armed group heavily backed by Iran. Thousands have already been killed there.
A multi-front proxy war stretches military and diplomatic resources to their breaking point.
Right.
Tehran is currently watching its most valuable regional ally, Hezbollah, engage in a massive existential conflict with Israel, while Tehran itself faces a U.S. blockade at its front door.
There was a 45-day ceasefire extension recently agreed upon between Israel and Lebanon, but it honestly sounds like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
It really is.
Hezbollah actively opposes the talks because Israel's core demand is their complete disarmament.
The ceasefire is hanging by a thread. I mean, if Hezbollah's disarmament is a non-negotiable demand for Israel and an unthinkable surrender for Hezbollah, the fighting is virtually guaranteed to resume.
Which puts Iran in an even tougher spot.
Right. This means Iran's leadership is operating under the threat of a catastrophic regional war exploding on multiple borders simultaneously. In that environment of paranoia and existential threat, relinquishing control of the Strait of Hormuz, which is their single greatest piece of leverage over the global economy, is highly unlikely.
So let's pull all these threads together. We have a 21-mile waterway holding a fifth of the global energy supply hostage. We have shipping insurance markets completely frozen by the threat of exploding LNG tankers.
Yeah.
We have a bond market predicting a surge in global inflation and interest rates. We have the U.S. engaging in transactional diplomacy, offering to lift sanctions on Chinese oil companies while demanding Iran yield.
Right.
We have China playing a delicate counterweight strategy, ensuring the U.S. stays distracted in the Middle East. And we have an Iranian regime that is deeply distrustful, surrounded by regional proxy wars, and backed by a heavily militarized populace of 31 million volunteers.
The complexity is staggering. It perfectly illustrates how a localized conflict instantly metastasizes into a global crisis.
Absolutely.
The physical flow of commodities, the psychological trust between diplomats, and the algorithmic reactions of financial markets are all inextricably linked.
It's a domino effect.
Yeah. A decision made by a naval commander in the Gulf of Oman today will dictate the manufacturing costs in a Chinese factory tomorrow and alter the interest rate on an American credit card by the end of the month.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's crucial to underline that our objective isn't to take a political side or endorse any specific nation's strategy.
Right, absolutely not.
Our mission is to parse through the statements, the military maneuvers, and the market reactions detailed in our sources to understand the underlying architecture of this standoff. We want to map out the reality of the global supply chain and the geopolitical leverage being utilized, no matter how murky those waters get.
And, mapping out that reality leaves us confronting a rather chilling vulnerability in our modern world.
What's that?
Well, if the price of our food, the stability of our local housing markets, and the fundamental engine of the global economy can be completely derailed by a single 21-mile stretch of water and the historical grievances of competing world powers, We have to question the resilience of our entire system.
That's a huge question.
It is. How sustainable is the architecture of modern global trade? Can any nation ever genuinely secure its own domestic economy when its survival is permanently outsourced to distant, hyper-vulnerable choke
Yeah,
points?
that is definitely something to sit with the next time you look at the price of goods at the store or see a headline about a distant naval standoff.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible systems that run the world around you, and we will catch you next time.